So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be doing another case from Scotland, which I don't think I've done a Scottish case in a long time. But this case is really unique in the way that it did happen in Scotland. However, the victim herself was Irish. So that's a whole two nations that were affected by this incident. Well, the whole of the UK was affected by it. But before we get into the case, I would just like to thank our sponsors for this video, Spotlight. Anyone that knows me knows that I am an avid coffee drinker. I literally have one right here. You can't write this. And I'm always worried that I'm staining my teeth by the amount that I drink, and so proper good oral care is so important to me. But it has to be good stuff, you know. I have really sensitive teeth, so I can't just use any old thing, but I recently discovered and fell in love with Spotlight. Spotlight, the brand, was created by two Irish dentists using clinically proven harm-free ingredients. Their products are 100% vegan, cruelty-free, toxin-free, sulfate-free. They're a sustainable brand. All of their packaging is recyclable. They're just amazing. I use both the Sonic toothbrush and the whitening strips, and I've already noticed such a huge difference, both with how white my teeth are and just how clean my teeth are as well. And it also doesn't make my sensitivity worse, which is an absolute essential for me. It's so chill because you can just put the whitening strips on while you're doing your makeup, and then by the time you finish getting ready, your teeth are blinding white. If you guys want to try out Spotlight, they are very kindly offering you guys 25% off of your first order when you click the link down below in the description and use my code, which is Eleanor25. Thanks again so much to Spotlight for sponsoring this video. Now I'm gonna get into the case. But quickly before I do, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about a relatively recent case from Scotland. However, the victim herself was from Ireland, so we'll start over there. Karen Buckley was born in 1991. She was the first child to John and Marion Buckley, later having three younger brothers, making Karen the first of four siblings. She was born and raised in an area named Morn Abbey in County Cork in southwest Ireland, and this area was very small, very rural. It was a farming community. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone. All the kids play together, all the parents are neighbours and they're all friends. And Karen Buckley was a very nice, normal girl. She had a nice friend group, she liked travelling and going out to socialise. By all accounts, she was just your very nice, average Irish girl. She was known to be very kind, very caring, very sensitive, very tender with people. Like she was one to look after you, you know? She was always just trying to help people. She was very well liked. She was easy to get along with. Karen was also very family orientated. Her brothers and her parents were everything to her. Like, this was a very nice, close family. They were all very happy. Her and her three brothers often went to their local GAA club where they played Gaelic athletic sports for Clyde Rovers, particularly Gaelic football. Karen was very ambitious. She was very hardworking. She'd done well in school all her life, and then when it came to it, she went to the University of Limerick to study nursing. Like I said, she just loved caring for people. It was one of the things that she was best at, and that in turn manifested itself in a career in caring for people. She was very passionate about nursing. During her time in university, Karen worked as a waitress in the Hibernian Hotel and Pub, and her co-workers there recall her being such a positive person, always smiling. She could be having the worst day. She could be ill, she could be tired, she could be upset, but she would never be without a smile. She was always such a light for others. She did a lot of travelling around this time, both during and after her graduation from university. She went to places like Thailand, South America. She just liked experiencing different cultures, different walks of life. Karen graduated university with her nursing degree in the early 2010s, and she decided that for her first job in nursing, she was going to move to England. She became a nursing student at the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Essex, and it was while she was there, while she was working that job, that she realised she had a real passion for occupational therapy. She knew that that was the avenue that she wanted to take in this career, so she began looking up the kind of qualifications that you need to be an occupational therapist. She realised that she was going to need her master's degree, and so she was going to have to go back to university, and the only university, or the best university she could find that offered that course, was won all the way up in Glasgow in Scotland. So in January of 2015, Karen Buckley moved to Glasgow in Scotland and enrolled in Glasgow's Caledonian University to get her master's. While she was there, she got a flat with 3 other girls, 3 other students, and she was integrating into student life very well. They were very social, they were making friends, everything was going so well. The girls would go out drinking almost every single week, as do most students that age. And this day, April 11th, 2015, was no different. They all got ready together in the flat that evening. They were having pre-drinks at their place, just the 4 of them. Karen got dressed into a black jumpsuit, a black leather jacket, red heels. She took extra care with her hair that day. She curled some black hair extensions, clipped them in. She looked beautiful. She was ready for her night. They decided to go to Sanctuary nightclub that night, which was in the West End of Glasgow. They got a taxi there, they arrived shortly before midnight, and they went in. Everything was good. They were having drinks, they were dancing. It was going the same as any other night out ever had. And then around 1 a.m, so they'd been in the club about an hour at this point, Karen picks up her bag and tells her friends that she's just going to the toilet and she'll be back in a minute. So Karen goes off to the toilet, her friends carry on getting drinks, they carry on dancing, and then they realise that it's been a while since Karen left and she still wasn't back. So they were waiting for her and they were waiting for her, but she just wasn't coming back, and they were starting to get worried. She'd never just left before. I mean, the most reasonable explanation here was that maybe she'd gone home, maybe she just walked home by herself and not waited for the girls. But she hadn't done that. She hadn't even said goodbye to her friends. She'd actually also left her leather jacket with them because it seemed as though she was just going to the toilet and that she was coming right back. Maybe it had just been a last minute decision. Maybe she'd gotten to the toilet, maybe something had gone wrong, or, she just wanted to leave. And so she left. After all, this was a 24-year-old woman. If she wants to leave a club by herself, she can leave a club by herself. Her friends were a little bit intoxicated at this point. They were in a club, they were all drinking alcohol, and so I don't think they quite realised the gravity of the situation until they got back to the flat that night and Karen wasn't there. They all texted her or messaged her on different social medias thinking that maybe she'd just gone back to a boy's flat, maybe she'd met a boy in the club and gone back to his house. But still, Karen was very good at letting her friends know where she was and where she was going to be, She wouldn't just go to a boy's house and forget to text them. But she had been drinking, so maybe. But when her flatmates woke up the next morning and they went into Karen's room, she still wasn't there. She still wasn't home, and she hadn't texted, called, messaged any of them. Now, at this point, her friends were very concerned. This wasn't like her to just take off either by herself or with a stranger, to not text her friends back, to not be back by midday the next day. And like I said, she was 24 years old. She wasn't irresponsible. She was quite sensible in the way that she liked to keep people up to date with where she was if they were worried. And so because her friends knew that this was so out of character for Karen Buckley, they decided to go to the police station and report her as missing. Police interviewed all 3 of the girls to kind of get an idea of who Karen was, and they too agreed that this was very out of character for her. And so on that same day, her parents back in Ireland were contacted and informed that she was missing. So like I said, this case was of immediate high priority. This was a young woman that had gone missing in the middle of the night, intoxicated, in an area where she doesn't really know many people yet. There's a whole manner of dangers here. Maybe something happened to her when she was making her way home. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she fell over. Maybe she was intoxicated. She stumbled, she fell over, injured herself and couldn't get up. Or maybe something much more sinister happened. Maybe someone found her and took advantage of her drunk state in one way or another. Who knows where Karen could be right now? Within 24 hours of Karen being reported missing, her family had flown over from Ireland to Glasgow, and they were giving public appeals on the news, begging for anyone with any kind of information to report it to police. Karen's disappearance was spread all over the news and all over social media as well, with police specifically asking for anyone that could give any kind of eyewitness testimony, anyone that could have been at Sanctuary nightclub or just in the West End of Glasgow that night, to come forward and maybe say what they'd seen. And that was when police received one eyewitness statement, and this person said that they had seen Karen Buckley that night outside of Sanctuary nightclub speaking to a man. So the CCTV outside of the club was checked. I mean, it was already going to be checked, but by now police had gotten hold of the tapes. And on these CCTV tapes, police saw who they believed to be Karen. I mean, CCTV footage is never very good. But they believe they saw Karen and a man walking in the opposite direction of Karen's flat. Now, immediately this was quite worrying since Karen had told her friends that she was only going to the toilet. What happened in that space of time that stopped her from going to the bathroom that ended up with her outside speaking to a man walking away from the club? Police received a phone call just 2 days into the investigation from a man that had found what he believed to be important evidence in this case. He'd found a handbag in a bin, and when he'd looked through it, when he'd looked through the purse to try to find ID, to find its owner, it was Karen Buckley's purse. It was Karen Buckley's handbag that she'd taken to the club that night. Just in a rubbish bin outside of a local park, which was a few miles away from the club. Now, this was very concerning. How had it ended up there? Karen obviously hadn't done this herself. Why would she put her own handbag with all of her belongings, phone, purse, everything, in a bin? This seemed as though someone was trying to dispose of evidence. Through the help of witnesses that were at Sanctuary nightclub that night, police were quickly able to identify the man that was seen speaking to Karen, that was seen on the CCTV footage. And that man was 21-year-old Alexander Pacteau. So police got in contact with Pacto and brought him in for a questioning. Now, he wasn't necessarily a suspect, just a person of interest, just someone that had seen Karen after everyone else that day, and he probably had a better idea of her next movements, where she'd been after the club. And besides, he didn't seem guilty or paranoid or anxious in his questioning. He seemed very cool, calm, collected. He didn't seem like he was hiding anything. Pacto told police that he'd literally just met Karen then and there that night at 1 a.m. outside of Sanctuary nightclub. The two of them began talking, they hit it off, and he invited her back to his apartment for the night. He said that Karen agreed, he took her back to his flat, the two of them had consensual sex, and then she left his place at about 4 a.m. that morning. She didn't stay the night. And he said that the reason for this was that she'd actually banged her head on one of his bedposts that night, and this hit was very bad. It made her bleed, she was dizzy, she had a headache, and she wasn't feeling well afterwards. And so instead of staying the night at his like she planned to, she was just going to go home and be in the comfort of her own house. Now, this statement, it does make sense. It makes sense that she might have hurt her head and then gone home of her own accord. However, it did worry police that Alexander Pacteau gave that piece of information without being provoked, without being asked. Not to jump the gun or anything, not to label Alexander Pacteau as a suspect too early. However, people that have something to hide from police will often give up information unprovoked. They'll explain things before they've even been asked. So, for example, if police were to go and search Alexander Pacteau's home and maybe find Karen's blood on his bed, then he'd already explained that in his questioning, so it doesn't look as suspicious. If he'd already given an innocent reason as to why that blood might be there before he was even asked, then it doesn't look suspicious. But however, police are professionals and they've seen this a million times before, so it actually does end up looking suspicious because they know that trick. So for that exact reason, police decided to get a search warrant of Alexander Pacteau's home because they were a little bit wary of this man at this point in the investigation. Pacto was put up in a Holiday Inn hotel and he was put under 24/7 police surveillance as his home was being searched because, this man could potentially be a suspect. Searches were still going on elsewhere. It wasn't just Pacto's home. They were searching places like woods, fields, forests, bodies of water, just out of fear that maybe Karen was already dead and her body had already been disposed of. However, nothing had come up just yet. So Alexander Pacteau lived on a street named Dorchester Avenue, and as it was being searched, as the flat was being searched, other officers were going door to door, asking his neighbours about him, just trying to learn who this man was and, learn a bit more about that night. Had anyone seen or heard anything? And interestingly enough, Pacteau's neighbours couldn't really tell police much about him. No one had really spoken to him that much. He was quite to himself, not a loner, but, not antisocial. just didn't really involve himself. But other than that, none of the neighbours had really seen anything or heard anything, either on the night of Karen's disappearance or really since then. They hadn't seen Pacto doing anything weird or suspicious. However, the police weren't the only ones that were going door to door speaking to Pacto's neighbours that day. The press had actually gotten wind of the fact that a house was being searched on Dorchester Avenue, and so they all flocked to the scene. Basically, what was going on in this case was that police had said to the press that they were looking into one man in particular, but they hadn't identified this man, and the press, being the press, were desperate to identify this suspect and to get a name and a face on their magazine, on their front page. They wanted to be the first people to identify this man and to break this story. So the press were going door to door asking all his neighbours, like, who's the man in that house? Who are they questioning? And that is how the name Alexander Pacteau and the pictures of Alexander Pacteau were leaked to the press. Police weren't 100% ready to release that kind of information yet, but of course the press don't respect anything ever. And so the story was released anyway, and his face was everywhere. His name was everywhere. However, this was potentially quite a good thing because police ended up receiving a lot of leads from this. A lot of people calling in to tell them different things about Pacto. And one of these phone calls was from Pacto's former co-worker. Now, Alexander Pacteau had never really had permanent jobs. He'd just kind of picked up odd jobs here and there. And one of these men knew Alexander Pacteau because he used to illegally sell fireworks. And this man knew where Pacteau stored those fireworks. And he told police, well, if Pacto's looking to hide anything else, then it's probably going to be in that same location. This location was a farm named High Craigton Farm, and Pacto had a deal with the farm owner that he would rent out a shed space from him for £10 a week. And so that was where he was always keeping his illegal fireworks. I don't think he really did the firework thing anymore, but that was where he used to keep them. So police went there immediately. They got a search warrant and they began looking around this whole farm, this whole thing, this huge piece of land, all these different sheds, barns, everything. And one of the immediate things that they saw was a big burn patch on the ground. So it seemed as though a fire had been made there rather recently because the grass was freshly burnt. They continued searching through all of these sheds, through boxes and barrels, just in case they found a murder weapon, in case they found any of Karen's clothing or belongings, you know, anything. And then in one of the sheds, one officer came across a large plastic barrel, like in a big industrial blue plastic barrel. It had some stuff stacked on top of it, so he took the stuff off and he opened this barrel, and inside he found the body of Karen Buckley. But it wasn't just her body in this barrel. Her body was submerged in a liquid, and this liquid was later identified to be sodium hydroxide, which is a corrosive liquid, kind of like an acid. So whoever had put Karen's body in this barrel had been trying to dissolve it and get rid of evidence. For whatever reason, this hadn't worked. The chemical hadn't dissolved her body, had barely corroded it, and so her body could be recovered for a proper burial. It was damaged, don't get me wrong, however, the chemical hadn't reacted quite as fast as I think it should have done, or at least as fast as the killer wanted it to. The body was taken for an autopsy, however, due to the corrosion, not much could really be told from the body. However, one thing that was glaringly obvious was that Karen had been bludgeoned to death. She'd been beaten to death. Her head had multiple wounds on it. They could also very vaguely tell that she had self-defense wounds all over her arms and hands. So this had been a struggle, and Karen was fighting for her life. And as they'd done with Alexander Pacteau's flat, press got wind of the fact that this area was being searched, and they all flocked there. And some sources say that one reporter even found a gold earring on the floor, which is believed to have been Karen's earring. But then again, this piece of information might not be 100% correct, because the press do like to have their own exclusive information, exclusive stories, and it was this reporter that found it and identified it as Karen's earring. So was it really Karen's earring? I don't know. This reporter said that they recognised it from the pictures. Either way, police at the scene at Hyde Craigton Farm got in contact with the police that were monitoring Alexander Pacteau, and they informed him what they'd just found. And Alexander Pacteau was arrested then and there in the middle of a Starbucks. And that day, Karen's family were informed that this missing persons search had now turned into a murder inquiry. And, you know, it's bad enough to learn that your daughter had met this horrific fate when she was so young and she was so innocent and she had so much life ahead of her. She didn't deserve this. But it must have been even harder for the family because this was a country that they weren't from, Karen wasn't from. They weren't with all of their family and their loved ones to be able to grieve together and comfort each other. They were in the middle of Scotland. They didn't know anyone. This was the country that their daughter was murdered in, and now they were stuck there because they had to help in this investigation. But Scotland as a whole, more specifically Glasgow, which is where this case happened, all did as much as they possibly could to show their support to the Buckley family. There were memorials, there were candlelit vigils held, moments of silence, newsreaders were showing their support. And it all must have affected Scotland almost as much as it affected Ireland. Like, yes, Ireland had lost a wonderful citizen, someone that was going to make a huge difference one day. But Scotland were coming to terms with the fact that this was one of their own that had done this, one of their own that had committed this heinous act and taken the life of such a wonderful person. Carol Buckley's funeral had a huge turnout. There were so many people there from her university, from her old jobs, from her school, just friends, everyone. It was clear that Karen had touched a lot of people in her life and affected a lot of people. Meanwhile, Alexander Pacteau was now in police custody and awaiting his first questioning. But who was this man? Where had he come from? Why had he done this? Police wanted to find out more about him. And so police spoke to a lot of his friends and family just to get an idea of who this man was, what his day-to-day life was like, stuff like that. They found that Pacto had been born into a relatively wealthy family. His father was French, his mother was Scottish, and he was one of 4 children. And he'd never struggled a day in his life. He'd always got everything he'd ever wanted. They had money, they had a nice lifestyle. He was born into luxury. He attended a private grammar school, so it was a fee-paying school. He had to pay to go there. He was on the football team there, and he ended up graduating with average grades. He didn't have too many friends in school. He had friends, but just not a huge group. He kept his circle quite small. He just wasn't all that social in general. It was nothing too concerning because he was just a teenager. He was growing up, you know. A lot of teenagers are quite shy and not that social. But in his mid-teens, everything came crashing down for Alexander Pacteau. His parents split up, his father went bankrupt, and that was the source of most of their money. And so now his parents split up, his mother got custody of him and his siblings, so he was living with his mother, who was the lower income of his 2 parents. And this was a huge shock to the system for Pacteau. He'd been used to luxury and private schools and, you know, getting everything he'd ever wanted. And now he was living in a council flat with his mother. This was such an ego knock for him. He had to leave his private school since his family could no longer afford to pay for him to go there, and so he joined a public school for his A-levels. However, he didn't like it, it wasn't for him, and he ended up dropping out before he completed his exams at 17 years old. In November of 2011, Alexander Pacteau was in a very serious car crash that left him in a coma for several weeks. After that, he was unable to walk for 6 months. He was pretty much bedbound and wheelchair bound for 6 months, and then after that, when he finally learnt to walk again, he had to use crutches for a further year. This rendered him unable to work. He physically couldn't do anything. He couldn't walk anywhere, he couldn't do anything, and so he then began claiming disability allowances. At one point in his late teens, Alexander Pacteau and his mother started butting heads. They didn't get along anymore, and so it was mutually decided that Alexander was going to move in with his father. However, at this point, his father had a new life. He had his own life. He'd got a girlfriend, and I think this girlfriend had a child of her own. Sir Pacto moved in with his father and his father's girlfriend. However, he just didn't feel comfortable. He wasn't made to feel welcome. He didn't get on with his father's girlfriend, and after one particularly bad argument with the girlfriend, Pacto decided to move out and get his own place. And that was when he decided to get in contact with a friend and see if a friend wanted to move out with him, because he couldn't really afford to live alone because he was living off the disability benefits. So he and a friend decided to start renting this flat on Dorchester Avenue. Occasionally Pacto would illegally sell fireworks, and he would help out at a local garden centre just for a little bit of extra money, but it really didn't make him too much money on the side. And like I said, all of this was a huge ego knock for Pacto. He was used to living a life of luxury, and now he had to rely on handouts from the government. This wasn't what he was used to, and he didn't like it. But oddly enough, everyone that knew Alexander Pacteau at this point in his life was very fond of him. They viewed him as a very kind, very charismatic, very funny person, someone that they all liked being around. The only potentially negative characteristic that his friends pointed out was that maybe he was weirdly open. For example, Pacto often solicited prostitutes, and he would go into work at this garden centre occasionally and just tell everyone every detail. Like, it was stuff that people didn't really need to know, which wasn't concerning. It was just a little bit odd, not necessarily a red flag of anything at all. His friends actually describe him as a gentle giant, which is very disturbing when you think that someone with such a kind, harmless reputation could be capable of such horrors. He was very, very tall. I'm not exactly sure how tall, but he was huge. He had big, broad shoulders. He was just a big guy, a very seemingly strong man. So police decided to run Alexander Pacteau's name on the database to see what kind of man they were dealing with. Was this man a previous criminal? Was this his first run-in with police? And they found that he'd had a few charges against him in the past. For example, one of these was that he'd attempted to commit forgery once in the past. He'd printed out a bunch of fraudulent banknotes, and luckily police found him and seized them all before they managed to get into circulation. And for that, he received community service. However, it was another charge on his record that really worried police. When Pacto was just 17 years old, he was charged with the attempted rape of a 24-year-old woman in a dark alley in the same area in the West End of Glasgow where Karen had gone missing from. Pacteau had been walking down this street one night when he bumped into a woman, and the two of them got talking. She told him that she was on his way home, and he said, "Oh, well, so am I. I live that way. We can share a taxi if you want." So the woman agreed, and the two of them set off walking to the taxi rank through this dark alley. And as they did, Pacto pushed her against the wall and attempted to rape her. The victim screamed, and passers-by rushed to the scene to come and save her, and luckily she was unharmed and she was able to get away before anything happened. However, these passers-by witnessed Pacto doing his pants back up, like zipping his pants back up. So this woman took Pacto to court for this, and in court, Pacto was actually acquitted of this charge, so he wasn't sent to prison for this because he told the jury that he was gay, and so he'd never do this. He would never even want to have sex with a woman. He wouldn't want to have any kind of sexual contact with a woman, so he would never do that. And somehow they believed him. They just took his word for it that he was gay and that he didn't want to have sex with a woman, and so for them, that was evidence enough that he didn't try to rape this woman. I find that absolutely unbelievable. He said the only reason that he'd been adjusting his pants when those passers-by came along was that the woman had attacked him first, thrown him to the ground, and as he'd fallen on the ground, his belt buckle had come undone. I mean, I don't know about any of you watching this, but my belt buckle has never come undone when I've fallen on the ground. That just doesn't happen. But what was especially eerie about this court hearing was that Pacto actually said, and this is a quote, "I did not sexually assault this woman. I would never make an attempt to sexually assault this woman. I believe rape is the lowest of the low. I'd rather be charged with murder than attempted rape. But like I said, he was acquitted of that charge and he was let go with no kind of punishment. But as all of this was coming out onto the news, Karen Buckley's murder, Alexander Pacteau's face, his name was everywhere, this woman who he'd attempted to rape actually got back in contact with police to tell them her story again. She just thought it might help them to convict him, to know that he was capable of such violence and that he'd done it before. So anyway, at this point in the case, police have Pacto in for questioning and he tells them his timeline of events. Like I said, he told them that he'd met Karen for the first time ever in his life outside of Sanctuary Club that night. They got talking, they got flirting, and he invited her back to his home where they had consensual sex. She banged her head by accident and then decided she wanted to go home at 4 a.m. And then she left his flat and she never saw him again. And that was all he knew. But of course, police knew that that just wasn't the case. There was too much evidence to say that Pacto had a hand in her murder. So they tried to trip him up, to put him on the spot and either make him confess or say something that might incriminate himself. And they said, well, Karen Buckley's body was found with self-defense wounds all over her arms. Something happened to her that night. Someone killed her and you were the last person to see her alive. And so Pacto, on hearing that, he decided to change his story, change his version of events. He said that yes, he and Karen had gotten into a physical fight that night. However, she attacked him first and he was just trying to defend himself. He didn't want to hurt this woman. And that was actually the real reason why she left in the middle of the night, because they'd gotten into an argument, they had a fight, and obviously they didn't want to stay around each other, so she left and she went home in the middle of the night. But he was still sticking to that story that she left his house at 4 a.m, she went home and something must have happened to her on her way between Pacto's house and her flat. I mean, Pacto could come up with any kind of cover story he wanted to at this point, but the fact of the matter was that Karen's blood was found inside his house, the two of them were seen on CCTV together leaving the club, and her body was found decomposing in a shed that Pacto used to hide things from police. But police couldn't charge him just yet. They wanted to build up as much evidence as they possibly could against him, and so they decided to seize his mobile phone. They looked at his search history and they found that the morning after Karen disappeared, around 8 a.m. the next morning, he had Googled the properties of sodium hydroxide, which is also known as caustic soda, which is the corrosive liquid that Karen's body was found in. And as soon as police saw that, that was the last little piece of evidence that they needed to charge Alexander Pacteau with the murder of Karen Buckley. After speaking with the friends of both Karen Buckley and Alexander Pacteau, the prosecution were able to piece together a timeline of events that happened on the night of Karen's murder. So on Saturday, April 11th, 2015, like I said, Karen and her 3 roommates were all pre-drinking at their flat. They were having a nice time, all getting ready together, and then they left for the club at 11:45 p.m. Karen had only had a few drinks at this point, so she wasn't wildly intoxicated or anything. She was just tipsy. She just had a couple. The CCTV in the club even confirms that she was walking, talking fine. She was in a very sound mind at this point. She wasn't drunk. Karen and her friends were drinking, they were dancing, everything was as normal as any other night out had ever gone. Meanwhile, 21-year-old Alexander Pacteau was setting off for the club. Around 7 or 8 of his friends had been round at his flat that day. They were all pre-drinking at his, and then they decided to get taxis to Sanctuary. However, because there were 7 or 8 of them, that meant that they would have to take 2 different taxis. So one taxi was called, they filled it up, and then there was maybe like 3 of them left over that were going to get a second taxi to the club. So the first taxi goes to the club, and the second group of boys is about to call for a second taxi, and Alexander Pacteau was in that second group. But Pacto began saying to his friends that he couldn't really be bothered waiting for a second taxi. It was always quite hard to get a taxi into town on a Saturday because all the taxi firms were busy and he didn't want to wait. So he offered to drive them all to town, even though he'd had a few drinks and he'd had more than Karen. He was drunk, but he offered to drive under the influence to the club. And somehow his friends were all okay with that. And so they jumped in the car, they drove to the club, they all went inside, and everything was normal still for them. So both groups were now in the club, everything was going well, and then at 1 a.m, Alexander Pacteau decides to step out of the club for a minute, whether he wanted some air or a cigarette or whatever. I don't think he was planning on going home because he was just kind of stood about outside. He wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. And around this same time, Karen Buckley exits the club as well, and she crosses the road to the other side. And it was there where she was approached by a very tall man. This was Alexander Pacteau. She didn't know this man. This was literally the first time she'd ever spoken to him. CCTV footage from inside of the club confirms that neither of them had spoken in the club. They hadn't been anywhere near each other, so they hadn't met in the club and then planned to meet outside. This guy just approached her and the two of them spoke and they kept walking down this road. Of course, Alexander Pacteau is the only person that knows what they were talking about, and of course he isn't telling police that. So we don't know what was said, but we can tell from the CCTV footage that it didn't seem flirty. There was no touch, there was no holding hands or him putting his arm around her or, there was nothing like that. It genuinely looked like two people that had just met walking down the road. It's theorised that Pacteau offered Karen a lift home in his Ford Focus and she accepted. And within just 20 minutes of meeting him, Karen Buckley was murdered. Pacteau did originally set off driving in the direction of Karen's flat, and so I'm sure she believed that he was genuinely giving her a lift home. However, a few minutes into this drive, Pacteau turns off onto quite a deserted road. CCTV on that street sees the car park up, pull over on the side of the road, and it stays there for 12 minutes and 46 seconds. And it's believed that in that 12 minutes, Alexander Pacteau murdered Karen Buckley. As I said before, Karen's cause of death was bludgeoning. She'd been beaten to death. It's believed she'd been hit around 13 times with what they think to be something like a large, heavy wrench. And she'd actually been beaten so hard that this had caused a subdural hemorrhage. After the murder, Pacteau drove around for a little while until eventually pulling in at a local park and disposing of Karen's handbag in a rubbish bin. He then drove back home and he was back in his flat by 2 a.m. And all of this had happened within an hour of Karen leaving the club. Once he was home, he carried Karen's lifeless body into his flat, wrapped her up in a sheet, and then left her on the floor while he crawled into bed and slept just a few feet away from his murder victim. The next morning, he woke up around 8 a.m. and began planning how he was going to dispose of this evidence, dispose of Karen's body. And that was when he grabbed his phone and Googled sodium hydroxide, the corrosive fluid that Karen was later found in. Pacteau left Karen's body in his bedroom, locking his bedroom door on the way out so that his roommate couldn't go in. He got in his car once again with the blood all still inside it, by the way. He hadn't cleaned up after killing Karen in the passenger seat of his car, and he drove to a local B&Q, which is like a homeware store in the UK. He left his car in the car park. Bear in mind this was in broad daylight now. It was the morning and there was blood all over his car. He just left it there for anyone to walk past. He went inside the B&Q store and purchased 9 litres of sodium hydroxide, a mask and some gloves. He then drove to a local pound stretcher, which is just a cheap shop in the UK, and he bought even more sodium hydroxide. So to not look too suspicious, if he bought a huge amount all from one place, he was spacing it out. He then drove back home to the flat. He put Karen's body inside his bathtub and then began pouring the sodium hydroxide over her naked body. He waited around for a while, waiting for the chemicals to start reacting and start dissolving her body, but it was taking a lot longer than he'd expected it to. So in an attempt to try to speed up the process, Alexander Pacteau made one large incision in Karen's body, all the way down her torso, from the top of her chest to the bottom of her abdomen. However, this corrosion process still wasn't fast enough for him. He shared a bathroom with his roommate who was currently at work, but was going to be home by 8 p.m. that night, and by now it was probably around 5 p.m. He knew that his time was limited and that he needed to have Karen's body gone by the time his roommate got back. He knew he was going to have to do this some other way, and so Pacteau began trying to bottle up the sodium hydroxide from the bath once again so that he could maybe use it at a later date. He then rinsed and dried Karen's body and carried it back to his bedroom, where for the second night in a row he slept just feet away from his murder victim. The next morning he woke up bright and early at 5 a.m. knowing that he had to transport this body without anyone seeing, and so first thing in the morning was probably the best way to do that. The first thing he did was drive to a local canal and throw in the murder weapon, that huge heavy wrench that he for some reason kept in his car. He then drove to some shops again. He went to a Tesco and I think another pound stretcher, and there he purchased alcohol, not the drinking kind, but you know, the one with really high percentages that's often used for, I don't know, other purposes. It's used for genuine technical purposes. He also bought a lighter, some padlocks, and some more clothes. He walked up to one of the staff at this supermarket and asked them what the best product was to get blood out of his mattress. He then drove back home and loaded his car with different pieces of evidence. So his mattress, sheets, Karen's clothing, and then he drove them to High Craigton Farm and lit a fire using that alcohol and the lighter, and this was what that burnt patch in the grass was, from where he was burning all of this evidence. He then drove back home and ordered online a big plastic barrel, like a big industrial plastic barrel, to collect later that day. He went to pick up the barrel a few hours later, he brought it back home, filled it with the sodium hydroxide that was left. He then put Karen's body inside, sealed this barrel, and then took the barrel back out to his car. One of his neighbours even told police that they'd witnessed him trying to get this huge barrel into his car, and he was struggling, obviously, because it was very heavy. It was full not only with Karen's body, but then with loads of liquid as well. And it was huge. It was a huge barrel as well. Eventually, he managed to get it into his car and drive off, going back to High Craigton Farm. Like I said, he was renting a storage shed at High Craigton Farm from the farmer that owned it for about £10 a week. And so he carried the barrel into this storage shed. There he secured it with a bunch of padlocks. He put over like a dirty sheet and then piled some other objects on top of it to make it look less suspicious, to make it look like it had just always been there. I think he put like a bicycle wheel on top, an old paper shredder, and then when he closed the door of this storage shed, he padlocked that up with a few different padlocks, and then he left High Craigton Farm for the last time. He drove back home to his flat that evening, and to his surprise, police had already been. He'd already been identified as the man that was seen speaking to Karen outside of the Sanctuary nightclub that night. Police had originally come to the flat at around 4:30 p.m. However, Pacto wasn't home when they'd got there. So they had to get in contact with his landlord, who had a spare key, and he said he was going to come and let police in, but by the time police got there the second time, Pacto was already home. And when they came in, police actually walked in on Alexander Pacteau scrubbing his carpets, and there was a very strong smell of bleach in the flat. Pacto looked up at the police and said, I was just going to come and see you. So police had a quick look around his flat and they noticed a few weird things, such as his mattress was the wrong fit for his bed and it didn't have any sheets on. They noticed that his bedroom didn't have much stuff in it, but the stuff that it did have, the stuff that was kind of laying about on the surfaces, was very strange. There was like a roll of tape, a toolbox, a couple of different nail brushes. Who keeps multiple nail brushes out on the side? So this was already looking bad for Alexander Pacteau before he'd even been brought into the police station for the first time. As he was brought in for questioning, his car was also seized and it was searched, but by now they couldn't really find anything. Well, with their eyes anyway. Instead, they decided to bring in cadaver dogs that can smell the scent of blood and of human corpse, and these dogs alerted to the smell of Karen Buckley's blood in Pacto's car. They also found some other pieces of forensic evidence throughout this case. Of course, they'd been forensically testing pretty much everything they'd got. They found some of his fingerprints on the inside of this big industrial barrel. On his tyres of his cars, they'd found a particular type of mud that matched the mud at High Craigton Farm, so they knew that it was him in his car transporting the body there. The evidence was just stacking up against Alexander Pacteau, and he knew it, and I think he was getting very anxious at this stage, very overwhelmed. And so when it came to his first trial, he decided to just plead guilty to the murder of Karen Buckley. And that meant that a trial didn't have to go ahead. This was just his first court hearing where he decides his plea, and if they plead guilty, then there's no reason for a trial. So on the 8th of September 2015, Alexander Pacteau had his sentencing hearing. He didn't need a full trial, but he did need to come to court one more time just so that the judge could decide how long he was going to be in prison for. And on this court date, Alexander Pacteau was very emotional, very remorseful. He was crying. He was suddenly very different to what he'd been like throughout this whole investigation. Like I said, he was very cool and calm in all of his questionings. He was very matter of fact. He wasn't upset about anything that had happened, but now he seemed like he was. One of the officers that was questioning Pacteau all the way through this actually said that he thought that Pacteau enjoyed it, that he liked all the attention. Anyway, at this court hearing, the judge described Alexander Pacteau as a callous and calculated human being, and she sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum of 23 years. The minimum sentence normally would have been 25 years, but because he pleaded guilty, legally she has to honour that and give him a lesser sentence. However, it is still life in prison, and there is still a chance that he will never get out. And I think it is unlikely that he will ever be released, especially due to the lengths that he went to try to hide the body and dispose of the body. He literally bought a corrosive substance to dissolve the body in. Like, he thought he was going to get away with this. I think at the end of that year, so just within a couple of months of receiving his sentence, Pacteau tried to appeal the sentence. But a couple of days before it was due to go to court for the appeal hearing, he actually withdrew that. So it never went to court. Pacteau's prison life has been a misery. Quite frankly, he has been targeted by other prisoners. They all hate him. They all want to harm him. He's actually been transferred prisons once for his own safety. But yeah, that is about all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a thumbs up down below. Thanks again to Spotlight for sponsoring this video. If you want to get 25% off of your first order, make sure you click in the link down below in the description and use code Eleanor25. Thank you so much to all of my channel members for helping me pick the cases that I cover, especially all of my tier 2 members whose names are on screen right now. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there'll be a link right here. And if you want to watch another video, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!